Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'm here to discuss yet another part of my series of lectures on narratology. Now, if you've been following this series, there are already 3 lectures before this one in which we covered the introduction to narratology. Then we discussed the mediated and unmediated enunciations, what do they mean? And then we went on to the origins of narratology from formalism as well as structuralism, but mostly the structuralist basis of it. So today I will talk about, first of all, how the narrative structure is organized, and then how do narratologists approach it. Now, crucial in understanding this would be, of course, as the previous video, is at least a basic understanding of Saussurean linguistic and how a semiological chain works, right? Or semiotic chain works. So let's watch the videographic explanation that I've prepared for you. And there are some explanations of concepts there, and the narrative structure, and the beginning of how narratologists actually go and analyze narratives. And then I'll come back and conclude this conversation and with the hope that we all understand it better. So let's go and see the videographic representation. Okay, so we are now moving into the structures of narrative. How is narrative looked at structurally and then analyzed? Right? And so as if we look at the definition of narrative, we know that it's causal connection of different representations, different events. So if a narrative is a representation of a series of events, then we can analyze it horizontally, right? And from one event to another, and this corresponds to what is called the syntagmatic axis in a semiotic chain in linguistics, right? Remember, there is a paradigmatic axis which is vertical and syntagmatic which is horizontal. So that would be one way of studying a narrative. So if you look at this diagram, the horizontal axis, the man cried, right, is a semiotic chain. But the paradigmatic axis, which is vertical, always has a bearing on the semiotic chain, right? Like the man in the man cried can be changed by boy, can be changed by died. So while in a syntagmatic axis, horizontal axis, the order of signs cannot really be changed because they are interconnected, right? The meaning would shift. Similarly, if we shift a signifier and place something else vertically, the meaning of the semiotic change will change. Now in narratology, both these axes are at play, but by and large, it's the paradigmatic axis, the vertical axis, that is read into the structure of a narrative. So if we just study the elements that comprise a narrative and their relations in a connection, then we are studying the horizontal axis of a narrative, and that would be a syntagmatic analysis. But if we are studying different levels, that would be vertical, right? And that could, the editors of this book that I'm using call it the hermeneutical, right? So the vertical axis has levels of analysis. First of all, we look at the events represented, and then we look at the structure of that representation. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at it. One comes from Boris Tomoshky, which is fabula and sujet, or sujet, right? Fabula is the raw material of the story. Sujet is its organization into a plot, right? But the editors of this book are going with another definition or another structure of the vertical readings, and that they are taking from Mieke Bal. And that has what we call fabula, right? And story and the text. And we'll get to it in a minute. But for right now, so text, story, and fabula, right? Now, the text obviously is the linguistic text, fully formed, printed, or filmic, right in front of us, right? The story is the next level. So at the outer limit of our text, if you look at vertically, is the text that you and I encounter. The story is the narrative story told from different points of view, right? And that is the story because the text contains the story, signifies it. And then within the story is fabula. Fabula are the raw materials of a story, and I'll explain that a little more. So the outer layer is the text, then there is the story within the text, and within the story is contained the kernel of a story, unarranged, and that is the fabula. Now if you look at this representation, at the far top end is the author, bottom end is the reader, then we get the narrative text, within the text is the story, and the heart of the story is the fabula. Now these things play heavily in the narrative analysis of a narrative in narratology, and we'll talk about it a little more now. So I hope that clarified certain things. So since a narrative is causally connected representations, right? So the easiest way of studying, of course, is laterally or horizontally, where we study the connections of one part with the other. But if we are coming from a structuralist point of view, then we also have to study the levels of representation, and that's what takes us to the paradigmatic axis or hermeneutical axis that the editors call it. And so going over again, so fabula, as we understand, is the unarranged core of a story. Now if you follow it all the way to fairy tale collections and all, those are unorganized cores of different kinds of stories, right? And then we have the story, right? So remember, we're going with 3 levels of narrative: fabula, the story, and the text. So fabula is whatever raw materials about a story are available, right? The story is the chronological or logical arrangement, stylistically, otherwise, of the fabula. And then the text is what we get, a fabula arranged within a sequential story, stylistically. And the text is a representation of it. It can be a film, it can be a book. And now when the structuralists study, let's say, a text or a novel, these are the levels at which they can study. How do they connect? How is the story arranged, right? What is the possible fabula of a story, right? That's why it's important to understand these terms. I'm not dwelling on the 2 terms that were explained earlier, because according to the editors of the book that I'm using, and the link is in the description, these are the 3 elements of narrative analysis that they use, which is the text, story, and fabula. And the editors give an example. And the example is, let's say, if you've read Robinson Crusoe, what they say is that the text is the linguistic artifact, the novel that we get. We buy, we read it, we consume it, right? The fabula is whatever happened to Robinson in his travels, right? Unarranged, juxtaposed with each other, right? The story is the precise way in which that action is conveyed, the way the fabula is arranged into a specific, and I'm quoting here, cognitive structure of information, right? So just to sum up, because we'll move on to more complex discussions, there are 2 ways of structurally studying any narrative. One is if we move along the horizontal axis and look at the causal connection of different elements in the representations. A more complex way is to go and move on a paradigmatic axis, and that is a hermeneutic axis, because you're trying to find how this part connects to something here, and then something here. And that is what that takes us outside the text, right? Is that right at the heart of it is the raw materials, the fabula. Then we can study, okay, here is where the raw materials come from in this narrative. The story part of it tells us here is how they are arranged and why, right? And then we can study the actual text itself, how it is organized, how it is proffered. So these are the three vertical aspects of a narrative that can be studied in narrative theory, in narratology. And we will now, after this, go into more details of how different scholars, different critics use this knowledge to study narrative. What is already becoming obvious to us is that when you're doing narrative analysis of the texts, of narratives, remember, text is a part of the narrative, then a lot of times what's in a text doesn't only determine the narrative or its meanings. The words, the signs only are not enough. We have to read the signs in their verticality, in their depth. That's why in a previous lecture where we talked about where they were saying that the words in a poem are themselves signified, and what signifies them is the larger structure within they are posited. So we'll move into a slightly more complex discussion after this. I hope this was useful and clear. If not, send me a question through the comments and I'll try to clarify things. And with this, thank you so much, and please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And please do keep in mind that I also have a new channel which is called Raja Against the Machine. The link will be in the description. I'll be deeply grateful if you will subscribe to that one as well. Thank you, goodbye, and as always, peace and love.